A group of Senate Democrats is calling on federal agencies to investigate the threat posed by domestic terrorists and extremist groups following the deadly Capitol riots. The senators, including Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, say the mob launched a planned, coordinated, and deadly terrorist attack on the Capitol on January 6th. They say it was in an attempt to halt the constitutionally mandated counting of states' electoral votes. Their resolution also notes the unique insider threat posed by domestic terrorists, which is why they are asking federal agencies to review the threat posed by fringe groups. For more, let's bring in Frank Figliuzzi. Frank is a former assistant director of the FBI and author of The FBI Way, Inside the Bureau's Code of Excellence. Frank, welcome. This Senate resolution comes nearly a week after the Department of Homeland Security issued a bulletin warning, quote, ideologically motivated violent extremists with objections to the exercise of governmental authority could continue to mobilize to incite or commit violence. Frank, what challenges do law enforcement agencies face in combating domestic terror threats, and how are domestic threats handled compared to foreign threats?
I'm glad we're having this discussion because the discussion needs to take place on a national level. First, let's understand something. We still don't have a law against domestic terrorism. We actually define domestic terrorism in the Penal Code of the United States. We just don't outlaw it. And it's the only criminal investigative program in the FBI where they can investigate you for it, but they can never charge you with it because there is no such crime. That's why we're seeing arrests, for example, Elaine, in the insurrection for things like assault, theft of Nancy Pelosi's podium, trespass, right? But think about it. When someone robs a bank, we don't arrest them for trespass in the bank. We arrest them for the serious crime of bank robbery. It's a crime against the federal government because they insure the money. On January 6th, people tried to steal our democracy, and we're arresting them for trespass. There's something wrong with that picture.
Is part of the reason, Frank, this hesitance, perhaps because of a concern over civil liberties? This is something that I've heard discussed, that the reason you don't have the same kind of approach to domestic terror threats with respect to what you just laid out, where you might have a very specific capability when it comes to a foreign terror threat, is because there is a bit of a history when it comes to civil liberties being, as critics would say, violated in the past.
There's no question, Elaine, that there are valid civil liberties and privacy and First Amendment free speech concerns here. But here's the trap we fall into. Whenever anybody proposes a domestic terrorism law, we jump immediately to the discussion of, well, that must mean we're going to spy on Americans. And the reality is what most of us are simply saying is, can we please have a law that simply has consequences commensurate with the gravity of the crime? We're not yet really getting into the discussion of whether we should designate domestic groups, whether we should have an enhanced intelligence powers and collection powers. Let's just agree whether or not we can have severe consequences that we have for international terrorism. So, for example, if you change the religion of the people entering the Capitol on January 6th and committing those crimes, change it to Islam, make their mission violent jihad. And now, all of a sudden, we have an international terrorism law that puts them into prison for 20 years to life. That's what I'm advocating for.
Well, in the weeks since the attack on the Capitol, we've learned, as you know, that there were threats and groups on the radar of various law enforcement agencies, including the Capitol Police. Frank, do you think there were missed opportunities to possibly stop this attack? And what do you think law enforcement could have done differently?
I think we'd be foolish to sit back and say, well, everything went perfectly and there weren't missed opportunities. I believe there were. But what I've been saying to folks, Elaine, is not that this was an intelligence failure, but rather it was a failure to act upon available intelligence. You could sit back at home, watch social media from extremists and violent sites, and you could see this playing out in the 2 weeks prior to the insurrection. The problem is most Americans think the FBI is watching everything in social media and has this amazing ability to see this play out. They do not. They do not have the legal authority to do it, and they don't have the resources to do it, even if they wanted to. That's why I'm such an advocate for this law that would at least allow them to point to violence that's imminent or about to happen and say, we've got a law that allows us to get in early and prevent it. You notice we haven't had a major act of terrorism in the United States, international terrorism, since 9/11. That's because the tools are there, the law is there, and it should mirror the threat we're now facing from domestic terrorism.
So, Frank, in the absence of that kind of law, what do you think can be done to prevent another attack like we saw at the Capitol on January 6th?
Well, I'm both encouraged and discouraged by what you talked about, which is this call for more analysis, more study, more money thrown at the problem. The FBI has been saying for years that the domestic terrorism threat is something they can't get their arms around. The director has testified on the Hill at least twice last year saying the #1 threat is domestic terrorism, the #1 threat is hate-based terrorism. The FBI Agents Association, the rank and file men and women of the Bureau, have said to Congress, we don't have the tools to handle this. So we need a holistic approach, a kind of de-radicalization of a segment of our population that requires business, corporate, educators, government, clergy, everyone rowing in the same direction to expose the truth and transparency, get people out of the amplified echo chambers that they live within, and get people talking about the truth. Separate violent actors from people who merely have an ideology on the right, which is perfectly fine, right? But not to associate them with violence. We need to separate the mob from the violent actors and start a de-radicalization movement.
Former Assistant Director of the FBI, Frank Figliuzzi. Frank, thank you very much.
Thank you.